there lived a man named Hanzo. He was not a king, but he ruled more than any king ever could. They called him the White Tiger because he was silent, powerful, and very dangerous. Hanzo lived in a mansion built of black stone and glass, perched high above the crashing waves. He was a man of few words, and his eyes were like cold steel. Everyone feared him, for his handshake could bring fortune, but his frown could bring ruin. He was the boss of the city's shadows, controlling everything from the ships in the harbor to the lights on the streets. Yet inside that cold stone house, he was alone. He lived behind bulletproof glass and heavy iron gates, surrounded by guards who were paid to die for him. But money does not buy loyalty, and fear does not buy love. Hanzo knew this better than anyone. He spent his nights staring at the ocean, wondering if he would ever find someone who saw the man behind the monster. His world was one of gold and blood, a gilded cage where every shadow held a potential blade. In the city below, people whispered his name in prayers and curses, but none dared to look him in the eye. He was the master of Busan on the hill, a ghost in a suit, waiting for a storm he knew was coming. The peace he maintained was fragile, like thin ice over a deep, dark lake, and he knew that one day the ice would surely break. Into this world of cold steel and silence came a girl named Hana. She was not a warrior or a princess. She was a village girl with calloused hands and a heart that still knew how to hope. Hana had come to the mansion to work as a maid, driven by the need to support her sick mother in the valleys below. She was small, with hair the color of midnight and eyes that held the warmth of a summer hearth. On her first day, the head housekeeper warned her never to speak to Master Hanzo, never to look him in the eye, and never to enter his study without permission. "He is a winter storm," the old woman said, "and you are but a petal." But Hana was not afraid of storms. She had grown up in the mountains where the wind howled through the pines, and she knew that even the coldest wind has a center. She cleaned the long, silent hallways and polished the heavy silver, moving like a ghost through the halls of power. She watched the men in dark suits with their hidden guns and their hard faces, but she did not flinch. She saw Hanzo once, from a distance, standing on the balcony. He looked so small against the vastness of the sea, a lonely figure wrapped in expensive wool. While others saw a predator, Hana saw a man who had forgotten the sound of laughter. She didn't know then that her life was about to become a bridge between his darkness and the light, or that she would soon be the only thing standing between him and the grave. The days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the mansion grew heavy. A rival named Kang, a man with a heart of crushed glass, was moving through the city like a plague. Kang wanted Hanzo's throne, and he didn't care how many bodies he had to stack to reach it. Hanzo knew the threat was growing. He stopped eating, his face becoming a mask of exhaustion. Hana noticed. She noticed the way he rubbed his temples and the way his hands shook slightly when he reached for his coffee. One evening, against all the rules, she left a small bowl of warm honey ginger tea on his desk. She didn't leave a note, she just left the warmth behind. From the doorway, she saw him look at the tea with suspicion, then with curiosity. He took a sip, and for a brief moment, the tension in his shoulders dropped. It was the first act of kindness he had experienced in years that didn't come with a price tag. He looked up and caught a glimpse of her hem disappearing around the corner. He didn't yell, he didn't call the guards, he simply drank the tea. In that house of secrets, a tiny seed of trust was planted in the frozen ground. But outside the gates, Kang was sharpening his knives. He was gathering men who were hungry for power and thirsty for blood. The storm was no longer a distant rumble. It was at the doorstep, and the White Tiger was tired. Hana continued her work, her presence a quiet melody in a house of discords, unaware that the honey ginger tea had already marked her as a player in a very deadly game. Hanzo began to watch Hana, not with the eyes of a boss, but with the eyes of a man wondering about a mystery. He noticed that she hummed while she dusted the ancient vases. He noticed that she spoke to the wilted plants in the solarium until they began to bloom again. One night, he called her into the study. The room was dark, lit only by the embers in the fireplace. Why are you not afraid? He asked, his voice a low growl. Hana stopped her cleaning and looked at him. She didn't bow her head. Fear is a choice, master, and I have seen harder things than a man in a quiet room. Hanzo laughed then, a dry, rusty sound that hadn't been heard in that mansion in a decade. He realized that this girl, who smelled of lavender and soap, possessed a strength that his guards lacked. She had the strength of spirit. He called her to sit, and for the first time in his life, he talked. He didn't talk about business or blood. He talked about the sea and the stars. Hana listened. She saw the loneliness he wore like a heavy cloak. As the night deepened, the bond between the wolf and the lamb began to change. But as they spoke, a black car slowed at the base of the hill. Inside was Kang, holding a map of the mansion's ventilation system and a silenced pistol. The predator was moving, and he was not coming for tea. He was coming to end the reign of the white tiger, and he didn't care who got in the way of his bullets. The mansion felt different the next morning. The air was thick and electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Hanzo was on edge, his instincts screaming that the trap was set. He ordered the guards to double the watch, but he didn't know that Kang had already bought the loyalty of the man at the front gate. Treachery is a silent poison. Hana felt the shift too. She saw the way the guards whispered in the corners and the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. She went to find Hanzo, wanting to tell him to be careful, but he was locked in a meeting with his lieutenants. She spent the afternoon cleaning the grand foyer, her eyes constantly darting to the heavy oak doors. She felt a strange urge to stay close to him, a protective instinct she couldn't explain. She was just a maid, yet she felt like a sentry. As the sun began to set, painting the Busan sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, the power in the mansion suddenly flickered and died. The backup generators hummed for a second and then fell silent. Darkness swallowed the halls. This was not a regular blackout. This was the signal. Hana stood in the middle of the foyer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard the faint sound of glass breaking in the distance. The mansion had been breached. The fortress was no longer safe. She didn't run for the exit. She ran toward the stairs, toward the study where she knew Hanzo would be. She had to reach him before the shadows did. In the pitch black, Hana moved by memory. She knew every inch of these floors, every turn of the banister. Behind her, she heard the heavy boots of men entering the house. They weren't hiding anymore. Shouts echoed through the marble halls, followed by the terrifying thwip-thwip of silenced gunfire. The guards she had seen every day were falling. She reached the second floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear Master Hanzo's voice. He was shouting orders, but he sounded isolated. He was in the library, the furthest room on the east wing. Hana didn't think about her own life. She only thought about the man who had looked so small against the ocean. She reached the library doors just as a heavy explosion rocked the floor below. Kang's men were using grenades to clear the path. The smell of sulfur and smoke began to fill the air. She pushed open the heavy doors and saw Hanzo. He was standing behind his desk, but he looked different. He looked older. He was frantically reaching for a hidden compartment under the mahogany wood, but the mechanism was jammed. The heavy desk had shifted during the explosion, pinning the drawers shut. His gun, his only protection, was trapped inside. He looked up and saw Hana. "Run," he hissed. "Get out of here through the servants' passage." But Hana didn't move. She saw the door behind her beginning to buckle under the weight of a battering ram. She saw the fear in the eyes of the white tiger, and she realized that for the first time, he was the vulnerable one. "I am not leaving you," Hana said, her voice steady despite the chaos. She ran to the desk and put her small, strong hands against the heavy wood. Together, they pushed, trying to free the jammed drawer, but it wouldn't budge. The wood had splintered and wedged the metal shut. Outside the door, a voice boomed. It was Kang. "Hanzo, come out and die like a man, or I'll burn this whole mountain down with you inside." Hanzo looked at the door, then at Hana. He reached out and touched her cheek, his hand rough. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't your war." Hana looked him in the eye, the same way she had when she told him fear was a choice. "You gave me a home when I had nothing. This is my war now." The door groaned again. A crack appeared in the solid wood. Through the gap, Hana could see the cold, glinting eyes of the attackers. They were like wolves circling a fallen stag. Hanzo was unarmed, his legendary strength useless against a locked drawer and a dozen guns. He slumped back against the wall, a bitter smile on his face. He had reached the end of his road. But Hana wasn't finished. She looked around the room, searching for anything, a tool, a lever, a weapon. Her eyes landed on a heavy iron fire poker resting by the hearth. It wasn't a gun, but it was solid. She grabbed it, the cold metal heavy in her hands. She stood in front of Hanzo, a small girl against the darkness, ready to face the monsters of the city. The library door finally gave way with a thunderous crash. Wood splinters flew through the air like shrapnel. 3 men burst into the room, their faces covered by black masks. They were led by a tall man with a jagged scar across his nose, Kang's right-hand man, a killer named Jin. Jin stopped when he saw the scene. He expected to find Hanzo begging for mercy. Instead, he found a maid standing in his path, holding a fire poker as if it were a holy sword. He laughed, a high-pitched mocking sound. "Move aside, little girl," Jin sneered, raising his pistol. "The boss wants the tiger, not the mouse." Hana didn't move. She planted her feet firmly on the expensive rug. "You will not touch him," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Hanzo watched her from the floor, his heart breaking and swelling all at once. He saw the way she looked at the guns, with a defiance that defied logic. Jin's laugh died down. He was annoyed. He stepped forward, intending to knock her aside with the butt of his gun. As he swung, Hana didn't shrink back. She swung the iron poker with all the strength she had gathered from years of mountain labor. The metal connected with Jin's wrist with a sickening crack. The pistol flew across the room, sliding under a heavy bookcase. Jin roared in pain, clutching his broken arm. The other 2 men hesitated, shocked that a servant had dared to strike back. That moment of hesitation was all the opening Hana needed to step back and shield Hanzo with her own body.
"Kill them both," Jin screamed, his face contorted in agony. The 2 other men raised their weapons, but just as they were about to pull the triggers, the mansion shook again. A secondary explosion from the lower floors caused the massive crystal chandelier above them to swing wildly. It groaned, its heavy chains straining. Hana looked up and saw the danger. She grabbed Hanzo's collar and pulled him toward the corner of the room just as the chandelier snapped. It came crashing down in a rain of glass and fire, landing directly between Hana and the gunman. The room was suddenly filled with a wall of flame and jagged crystals. The attackers were forced back, shielded by the debris. In the chaos, the smoke grew so thick it was impossible to see. Hana was coughing, her lungs burning, but she didn't let go of Hanzo. "The drawer!" she gasped. "The explosion moved the desk." Hanzo looked. The impact of the chandelier had indeed jolted the heavy mahogany. The jammed drawer had popped open just an inch. He lunged for it, his fingers clawing at the gap. He could see the cold blue steel of his custom revolver inside. He pulled, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted. But the metal was still caught on a bent hinge. He needed more time. Outside the circle of fire, Jin and his men were recovering. They were moving around the wreckage, their silhouettes visible through the dancing flames. They were coming for the kill, and the fire wouldn't hold them for long. Hana stood up again, her clothes scorched and her face streaked with soot. She saw Jin through the smoke. He had picked up a knife with his good hand, his eyes burning with a murderous light. He didn't care about Hanzo anymore. He wanted to destroy the girl who had broken his wrist. He lunged through the flames, ignoring the heat. Hana met him. She used the fire poker to block the knife, the metal clashing in a shower of sparks. She was smaller, faster, but he was a trained killer. He kicked her in the stomach, sending her flying back against the desk. Hana hit the wood hard, the air leaving her lungs in a painful rush. She fell to her knees, gasping, her vision blurring. Hanzo screamed her name, his voice full of a raw emotion he hadn't felt in years. He redoubled his efforts at the drawer, his fingernails bleeding as he clawed at the wood. Jin stepped over the fire, the knife raised high. "Goodbye, mouse," he hissed. He began his descent, the blade aimed at Hana's heart. But even as she lay there, broken and bruised, Hana didn't close her eyes. She looked Jin straight in the face. She saw the monster he was, and she felt no fear, only a deep, burning pity. She reached out and grabbed his ankle, tripping him just as he swung. The knife buried itself in the heavy wood of the desk, inches from her head. She had bought 5 more seconds, 5 seconds that would change the history of Busan on the hill. Those 5 seconds were enough. With a roar of pure, unadulterated rage, Hanzo gave one final, violent shove. The wood groaned and shattered. The drawer flew open. His hand closed around the grip of his gun, the tiger's tooth. It was a heavy, silver-plated weapon that felt like an extension of his own arm. He didn't hesitate. He didn't aim. He moved with the fluid grace of the predator he was. Bang! Bang! The 2 gunmen standing by the door fell before they could even blink. Then, Hanzo turned his gaze toward Jin. Jin was still struggling to pull his knife out of the desk, his eyes wide with the realization that the situation had turned. The white tiger was no longer trapped. He was hunted no more. He was the hunter. Hanzo stood up, his tall frame casting a long, terrifying shadow in the firelight. He didn't look like a tired old man anymore. He looked like a god of war. He stepped toward Jin, his gun leveled at the man's forehead. Jin dropped the knife, his face pale. "Wait! It was Kang! He made me do it!" Hanzo didn't speak. He looked down at Hana, who was slumped against the desk, her breathing shallow but steady. He saw the bruise on her face where Jin had struck her. His eyes turned colder than the deep sea. "No one touches what is mine," Hanzo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of death. The sound of the final shot echoed through the mansion, signaling the end of the first wave. Jin was gone, but the battle was far from over. Hanzo knelt beside Hana, his hard face softening for a split second. He checked her pulse and found it strong. "Stay here," he commanded. "Stay behind the desk. It's bulletproof." Hana tried to speak, but he pressed a finger to her lips. "You've done enough, little bird. You saved the tiger. Now, watch the tiger hunt." He stood up and walked toward the door, his movements precise and deadly. He didn't look back. He moved into the smoke-filled hallway, a shadow moving through shadows. Below, he could hear Kang voicing, screaming orders. Kang was frustrated. He had expected an easy execution, not a massacre of his own men. Hanzo moved through the mansion like a ghost. He knew every secret passage, every creaking floorboard. One by one, Kang's men began to disappear into the darkness. A muffled cry here, a single shot there. Hanzo was picking them apart with surgical precision. He wasn't just defending his home, he was reclaiming his legend. The men who had followed Kang for greed now felt the icy grip of terror. They realized they weren't fighting a man, they were fighting the spirit of the mountain itself. And the spirit was angry.
Back in the library, Hana struggled to her feet. She couldn't just sit and wait. The fire from the chandelier was spreading, licking at the heavy velvet curtains. If she didn't do something, the whole wing would burn. She found a heavy wool blanket and began to beat at the flames, her arms aching with every movement. She was exhausted, her body a map of pain, but she wouldn't let his sanctuary be destroyed. As she fought the fire, she heard the sounds of the battle moving toward the grand staircase. The climax was approaching. Kang was the only one left, and he was cornered. Hana managed to extinguish the worst of the fire, leaving the library a ruin of ash and broken glass. She leaned against the window, looking out. Down in the courtyard, she saw the black cars of the rival gang. They were waiting for a signal that would never come. She saw the flickering lights of the city below, so peaceful and unaware of the war happening on the hill. She prayed for Hanzo. She prayed that the man she had seen in the tea light would survive the monster he had to become. She realized then that she didn't just want to save his life, she wanted to save his soul. She had seen the flicker of light in him, and she knew that if he died tonight, that light would go out forever. On the grand staircase, Hanzo and Kang finally met face to face. The moon had broken through the clouds, shining through the high glass ceiling and bathing the marble in a ghostly light. Kang was disheveled, his expensive suit torn, his eyes wild with desperation. He held 2 pistols, pointing them blindly into the dark. "Show yourself!" Kang screamed. "You're a coward, Hanzo, a relic." Hanzo stepped out from behind a pillar, his gun lowered. He looked calm, almost bored. "A relic?" Hanzo asked softly. "Perhaps. But a relic still has a purpose." Kang laughed manically and fired both guns. Hanzo dove behind the marble railing, the bullets chipping away at the stone. He waited for the rhythm of the shots. Pop, pop, pop. Kang was firing too fast, wasting his lead. Hanzo counted the rounds. When he heard the telltale click of an empty magazine, he moved. He didn't fire his gun. He lunged forward, using his strength to tackle Kang. They tumbled down the stairs, a whirlwind of limbs and rage. They hit the bottom foyer with a bone-jarring thud. Kang reached for a hidden knife in his boot, but Hanzo was faster. He pinned Kang's arm to the floor, his eyes burning. This city belongs to the people who build it, not the ones who burn it. The struggle was brutal. Kang was younger and fueled by a manic energy, but Hanzo had the weight of experience and a new, strange fire in his heart. They crashed through the glass coffee table, shards flying. Kang managed to get a grip on Hanzo's throat, his fingers squeezing. Hanzo's vision began to darken. He saw the face of the man who wanted to take everything from him. But then, he saw a vision of Hana, standing in front of the gun, her small hand holding the iron poker. He remembered her words, "Fear is a choice." He wouldn't choose to die here. He found a sudden burst of strength, slamming his forehead into Kang's nose. The grip loosened. Hanzo rolled away and grabbed his fallen revolver. He stood up, towering over the defeated rival. Kang lay on the floor, gasping, his face a mask of blood and defeat. "Finish it," Kang spat. "That's what you do, isn't it? You're the white tiger." Hanzo looked at the gun in his hand. He looked at the wreckage of his home. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to pull the trigger. He didn't want more blood on his floors. He heard a soft sound at the top of the stairs. He looked up and saw Hana. She was watching him, her eyes wide and full of a silent plea. She didn't have to say a word. He knew what she was asking. Hanzo lowered the gun. He didn't kill Kang. Instead, he whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the mansion. From the shadows, 3 of his most loyal men appeared. They had survived the initial purge and had been waiting for the signal. "Take him," Hanzo ordered. "Take him to the authorities. Give them the files in my safe, the ones that prove every crime he's ever committed. Let the law do what I no longer wish to do." The men were shocked, but they obeyed. They dragged the cursing, screaming Kang away into the night. Hanzo stood alone in the foyer, the silence finally returning to the hill. He felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders. It was the weight of the crown he had worn for too long. He looked up the stairs at Hana. She was still there, leaning against the railing, looking like a tired angel. He began to walk up toward her, his steps slow and heavy. When he reached her, he didn't say anything. He just leaned his head against her shoulder. For the first time in 20 years, the white tiger allowed someone else to hold him up. "It's over," he whispered. Hana reached up and stroked his hair, her hand gentle. "No," she said softly. "It's just beginning." In the following days, Busan on the hill underwent a transformation. The news of the mansion massacre and the subsequent arrest of Kang rocked the city. But the real surprise was what happened to Hanzo's empire. He didn't disappear, but he changed. He began to dismantle the criminal aspects of his business, turning his vast wealth toward the city he had once ruled with fear. He built hospitals, schools, and parks. The white tiger became a symbol of reform rather than a shadow of dread. The mansion, once a fortress of solitude, was opened up. The dark curtains were pulled back, and the sun was allowed to fill the rooms. Hana remained by his side. She was no longer a maid, but she refused to be a queen. She was his advisor, his conscience, and his closest friend. They spent their afternoons in the garden, planting trees that would outlive them both. The people of the city began to tell a new story, a story of a maid who had more courage than 1,000 soldiers, and a boss who learned that the greatest power isn't the ability to kill, but the courage to change. However, peace is often a target for those who thrive in chaos. While Hanzo was rebuilding, the remnants of Kang's gang were hiding in the slums, plotting their revenge. They didn't care about the law or reform, they only cared about the gold they believed was still hidden in the mansion's walls. They saw Hanzo's new kindness as a weakness. They planned one final desperate strike. This time, they wouldn't come with a small army. They would come with a single, silent assassin, a man who specialized in the long-distance kill. He was a sniper known as the Vulture. He set up his position on a neighboring ridge, his eye pressed against the scope of a high-powered rifle. He watched the garden. He watched the man and the girl. He waited for the perfect moment when the sun would be at their backs and the wind would be still. He didn't care about the story of the Maid. He only cared about the price on the tiger's head. He adjusted the dial on his scope, his finger hovering over the hair trigger. He saw Hanzo laugh at something Hana said. It was a clear shot. Hana felt a sudden cold chill. It wasn't the wind. It was that same electric feeling she had felt the night of the attack. She looked toward the ridge, her eyes scanning the tree line. She saw a tiny flash of light, the sun reflecting off a glass lens. She didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. She threw herself at Hanzo, knocking him off the garden bench just as a bullet hissed through the air where his head had been a second before. The shot echoed across the valley. Hanzo reacted instantly, rolling into the cover of a stone fountain. "Sniper!" he yelled. He grabbed Hana and pulled her behind the thick marble base. The Vulture fired again, the bullet chipping the marble and spraying them with dust. They were pinned down. The guards were too far away, and Hanzo was unarmed. He had vowed never to carry a gun in his home again. He looked at Hana, his heart racing. "You saved me again," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you," she panted, her eyes bright with determination. "I am not leaving you." But they couldn't stay behind the fountain forever. The sniper was repositioning, looking for a better angle. Hanzo looked around the garden. He saw a reflective silver tray left over from their tea. He reached for it, his mind working fast. "Hana, when I say go, I want you to run toward the house. Don't look back." Hana shook her head. "No, we go together." Hanzo smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Trust me, I have a plan." He held up the silver tray, angling it to catch the afternoon sun. He used the reflection to blind the sniper, a brilliant light aimed directly at the ridge. The Vulture cursed and pulled away from the scope, his eyes stinging. In that split second of blindness, Hanzo and Hana bolted toward the mansion. They moved like shadows across the grass. The sniper recovered and fired blindly, the bullets thudding into the dirt behind them. They reached the heavy oak doors and slammed the locks. They were safe for now. Hanzo immediately picked up the internal phone and called his security team. "Get to the North Ridge," he commanded. "There's a guest who needs to be escorted to the police." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. The Vulture was captured before he could fire another shot. The incident with the sniper was the final test. It proved that Hanzo's enemies wouldn't stop, but it also proved that his new life was worth fighting for. He realized that he couldn't just walk away from his past. He had to finish the job of cleaning up the city. He spent the next year working tirelessly with the authorities, giving them everything they needed to dismantle the criminal underworld of Busan. He lost much of his fortune in the process, donating it to the victims of the gangs. But as his bank account shrank, his spirit grew. He became a man respected for his integrity rather than feared for his violence. Hana stayed with him through it all. She saw him at his lowest, when the guilt of his past actions weighed heavy on him. She sat with him during the long nights when the ghosts of his old life haunted his dreams. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting back into the darkness. She taught him how to forgive himself, a lesson far harder than any battle he had ever fought. The mansion eventually became a school for the children of the valley, a place where they could learn about art, science, and the history of their city. The grand library, once the site of a bloody battle, was now filled with the sound of children reading and laughing. The White Tiger was now the name of the school's scholarship fund. Hanzo and Hana lived in a small, modest cottage on the edge of the property. They lived a simple life, far from the gilded cage of the past.
They grew their own vegetables and walked along the beach every morning. The people of the city would often see them, a tall man with silver hair and a woman with eyes that held the sun. They looked like any other couple, but those who knew the history looked at them with a sense of wonder. They were living proof that no one is beyond redemption and that a single act of courage can change the course of 1,000 lives. One evening, many years later, a young boy from the school approached Hanzo as he sat on his porch. The boy had heard the stories and was curious. "Master Hanzo," the boy asked, "is it true that a maid once saved your life with nothing but a fire poker?" Hanzo looked at the boy, then at Hana, who was inside the house, lighting the evening lamps. He smiled, his eyes twinkling with a soft inner light. "It is true," he said, "but she didn't just save my life, she saved my heart. She showed me that the strongest weapon in the world isn't a gun or a knife. It's the willingness to stand in the way of a storm for someone else." The boy looked amazed. "I want to be brave like that," he said. Hanzo patted the boy's shoulder. "Then remember this, little one. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what is right, even when your hands are shaking. It's seeing the man behind the monster and choosing to stay." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Busan sky in gold and crimson, Hanzo felt a deep sense of peace. The city below was thriving, the lights twinkling like a fallen galaxy. The shadows were gone, replaced by the warm glow of homes and the steady pulse of a city at peace. He thought back to the night in the library, the smell of smoke, and the sight of Hana standing between him and certain death. He realized that every moment since then had been a gift, a second chance he didn't deserve, but had worked every day to honor. He looked at his hands, once stained with blood, now rough from the garden and the woodshop. He was a man who had finally found his home. He wasn't the boss of the shadows anymore, he was a gardener of the light. And as he listened to the sound of the waves, he knew that the white tiger was finally at rest.